In this episode, we will journey into one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in the history of the Roman Empire. 69 AD was a time of unprecedented chaos. It was a year of civil war, a year when the foundation of the empire was shaken to its very core. Within the span of just 12 months, the Roman world would witness the rise and fall of 4 separate emperors, each claiming the ultimate prize, each backed by the formidable power of Roman legions. The throne, once a seat of established authority, became a spoil of war, passed from one man to another, not by bloodline or senatorial decree, but by the bloody verdict of the battlefield. This single year of anarchy would not only decide the fate of these 4 men, but would also irrevocably alter the nature of power in Rome, revealing a new and dangerous truth about how an emperor could be made. To fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis that erupted in 69 AD, we must first turn the clock back slightly to the preceding year. The year 68 AD marked the dramatic and ignominious end of Rome's first imperial dynasty, the Julio-Claudians. This dynasty, founded by the great Augustus, had ruled Rome for nearly a century. It had given the empire leaders of immense capability like Augustus himself, but it had also produced figures of notorious cruelty and instability, such as Caligula and, most recently, Nero. Emperor Nero, Claudius, Caesar. Augustus Germanicus had been on the throne since the year 54. His reign began with promise, guided by capable advisors, but it slowly descended into a nightmarish spectacle of personal indulgence, artistic obsession, and lethal paranoia. Nero's extravagance knew no bounds. He built a colossal palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, in the heart of Rome after the Great Fire of 64 AD, a fire that many Romans whispered he had started himself to clear the land. He fancied himself a great artist, a poet, a musician, and a chariot racer, forcing the Roman elite to attend his lengthy and often embarrassing public performances. While he courted the favor of the common people with lavish games and handouts, he systematically alienated the 2 pillars of Roman power, the Senate and the military. He subjected wealthy senators to treason trials to confiscate their fortunes and fund his excesses. He grew deeply suspicious of his most successful generals, viewing their military victories as a threat to his own security. By the spring of 68, the Roman world had had enough. The first crack in his authority appeared in Gaul, where the governor Gaius Julius Vindex rose in open revolt. Although Vindex's provincial forces were defeated, his rebellion was the catalyst. It prompted another, more formidable figure to act. In the province of Hispania, modern-day Spain, the elderly and respected governor, Servius Sulpicius Galba, declared his opposition to Nero. This was a critical turning point. Galba was a man of consular rank from an old and noble family. His defection gave the rebellion a new legitimacy. Soon, the legions across the empire began to renounce their loyalty to the emperor in Rome. The final betrayal came from the Praetorian Guard, the elite troops stationed in the capital who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. Bribed by their prefect, they abandoned their duty to protect Nero. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, quickly followed suit, declaring Nero a public enemy and sentencing him to death. Hunted and alone, Nero fled the city he had so lavishly dominated. On the 9th of June in the year 68, he took his own life with the help of a loyal freedman, reportedly uttering the final words, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's death was not just the end of a tyrant, it was the end of an era. He left no children, nor had he designated an heir. With him, the bloodline of Augustus, which had defined Roman leadership for 4 generations, was extinguished. For the first time in nearly 100 years, the imperial throne was empty, and there was no clear or legal successor to fill it. The Roman Empire was adrift in a sea of uncertainty, creating a dangerous power vacuum that ambitious men with armies were all too eager to fill. This moment of crisis laid bare what the great Roman historian Tacitus would later famously describe as the arcane imperi, or the secret of the empire. And the secret was this: an emperor could be made somewhere other than in Rome. For a century, the succession had been a matter largely decided within the capital. It was a political game played by the imperial family, the senators, and the Praetorian Guard. But the true, ultimate power in the Roman Empire did not reside in the marbled halls of the Senate House. It was forged in the disciplined, hardened legions stationed on the far-flung frontiers. These were the men who guarded the Rhine against the Germanic tribes, who watched the Parthians in the east, and who kept the peace in Britain and Africa. The soldiers of these provincial armies now understood that their collective might was the ultimate authority. The loyalty of the legions and the swords they carried could elevate their own commanders to the imperial throne. The first man to seize this new reality was the 71-year-old Galba. With Nero gone, the Senate quickly recognized him as the new emperor. He began his slow march from Spain to Rome, a figure of old-fashioned Roman discipline and austerity. He intended to clean up the fiscal mess left by Nero's profligacy and restore a sense of order. However, Galba's stern and uncompromising nature, which might have been seen as a virtue in the old republic, proved to be his undoing in this new, volatile age. He was a man of the past, unprepared for the brutal realities of the present. But Galba was not the only contender. As he made his way to Rome, other powerful figures were watching and waiting. Along the German frontier, the legions were growing restless. They felt their commander, Aulus Vitellius, was more deserving of the throne. In Rome itself, one of Galba's earliest supporters, the ambitious nobleman Marcus Salvius Otho, was growing dangerously discontented. Otho had expected to be named Galba's heir and successor, and when the old man chose another, Otho began to plot his own path to power. And thousands of miles away, in the province of Judea, an unassuming but highly competent general was in the middle of suppressing a major revolt. His name was Vespasian. He commanded one of the largest and most battle-tested armies in the empire. He and his supporters in the eastern provinces were observing the unfolding chaos in the west, knowing that their moment might soon come. These four men, the elderly Galba, the resentful Otho, the indulgent Vitellius, and the pragmatic Vespasian, were the principal actors in the drama to come. The year 69 AD would be defined by their struggle for supremacy. It would be a year that saw Roman armies, honed for centuries to fight foreign enemies, turn their terrifying efficiency against one another. The heartlands of the empire, particularly Italy, would be ravaged by a civil war more destructive than any it had seen since the days of Augustus. In this episode, we will chronicle the brutal and rapid succession of these four emperors. We will explore how each man seized power, the fatal flaws that led to his downfall, and the decisive battles that shaped the destiny of Rome, culminating in the rise of a new dynasty from the ashes of a year of fire and blood. Part 1. Galba. Our story of the Year of the Four Emperors properly begins not in Rome, but in the province of Hispania, with the man who would first claim the throne after Nero, Servius Sulpicius Galba. Galba was, in many ways, the antithesis of the emperor he replaced. Where Nero was a young, self-indulgent artist, Galba was an elderly, hardened statesman and general. He was born in the year 3 before Christ, making him 71 years old when he took power. His life had spanned the reigns of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. He was a relic of a bygone era, a man steeped in the traditions of the old Roman nobility. His lineage was impeccable, tracing its roots back to the great families of the Republic. He was also immensely wealthy, a fact that added to his stature and independence. Throughout his long and distinguished career, Galba had earned a reputation for sternness and strict discipline. He had served as a provincial governor in Germania, where he whipped the legions back into fighting shape after the lax command of his predecessor. He had governed Africa with integrity and had earned triumphal honors for his military successes. But his defining characteristic was his severity, a trait that was often indistinguishable from cruelty. Anecdotes from his past illustrate this unforgiving nature. As governor, he had once ordered the crucifixion of a man who had poisoned his ward, and when the condemned man pleaded that he was a Roman citizen, Galba, in a moment of grim mockery, ordered that he be moved to a taller, whiter cross as a token of respect for his status. This was the man who, in the chaotic aftermath of Nero's reign, the Roman Senate and people looked to as a restorer of order. He represented a return to old-fashioned Roman virtues, discipline, fiscal responsibility, and respect for tradition. When the governor of Gaul, Vindex, first raised the standard of revolt against Nero, Galba was initially hesitant. He was old, and he knew the risks of challenging a reigning emperor. But when he learned that Nero had secretly dispatched orders for his execution, his hand was forced. In April of 68 AD, he addressed his troops in the city of New Carthage. In a carefully worded speech, he did not proclaim himself emperor, a treasonous act while Nero was still alive. Instead, he declared himself the lieutenant of the Senate and the Roman people. It was a masterful political move. He was not a usurper, he was a servant of the state, rising to liberate it from a tyrant. This declaration gave legitimacy to the rebellion and provided a rallying point for all who were discontented with Nero's rule. The support of other key figures, most notably Marcus Salvius Otho, the governor of neighboring Lusitania, strengthened his position. When news of Nero's suicide reached him in June, Galba's status changed overnight. The Senate, eager to fill the power vacuum and legitimize his authority, officially recognized him as the new emperor. Galba adopted the title Caesar Augustus and began his long, slow march towards Rome. This journey from Spain to the capital was the first indication that his reign would be fraught with difficulty. Instead of presenting himself as a benevolent savior, his actions along the way were marked by a harsh and unforgiving assertion of power. He punished cities that had been slow to declare for him with crushing taxes. He executed prominent officials who had remained loyal to Nero. The most notorious incident occurred as he approached Rome. A legion of Marines whom Nero had recruited from the fleet and was preparing for a campaign in the east intercepted Galba's procession. They pleaded with the new emperor to confirm their status as legionaries, which came with higher pay and prestige. Galba put them off. When they persisted, some even becoming disorderly, he gave a brutal orderly. He sent his veteran troops charging into the unarmed crowd of Marines, slaughtering many and decimating the rest. He then had the unit disbanded. This act of extreme violence sent a chilling message throughout the empire. This was not a ruler who would win loyalty through generosity. He would command it through fear. Galba finally entered Rome in October of 68 AD, an old man walking into a political firestorm. The city was financially destitute, the treasury completely emptied by Nero's boundless extravagance. The populace, accustomed to Nero's lavish gains and grain distributions, was restless, and, most dangerously, the soldiers, particularly the Praetorian Guard who had facilitated his rise to power, were expecting their reward. It was here that Galba would make the first, and perhaps most catastrophic, of his many missteps. Upon the accession of a new emperor, it had become customary for the Praetorian Guard to receive a substantial cash bonus, known as a donative. Their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, had promised them a staggering 30,000 sesterces per man in Galba's name to secure their defection from Nero. It was a sum Galba had neither the means nor the inclination to pay. Confronted with the demand, he delivered a response that would seal his doom. He declared, "I am accustomed to levy soldiers, not to buy them." From Galba's perspective, this was a statement of principle. He was a traditionalist who believed that a soldier's duty was to serve the state out of loyalty, not for financial gain. Paying the Praetorians would be tantamount to bribery, an admission that the throne could be bought and sold. He was also a pragmatist. The Roman treasury was empty, and such an enormous payout was simply impossible without imposing ruinous new taxes. However, the political reality was that the Praetorians did not see it this way. They saw a stingy old man breaking a promise and denying them what they believed was their rightful due. They had risked everything to abandon Nero and support Galba, and now he was treating them with contempt. This single statement turned his personal bodyguards, the very men tasked with ensuring his safety in the capital, into a resentful and hostile force, ripe for conspiracy. Galba's attempts at fiscal reform were equally clumsy and unpopular. He set up a commission to recover the vast sums of money and property that Nero had lavished on his favorites. On the surface, this seemed like a just and necessary policy. He decreed that recipients of Nero's largesse only needed to be left with 1/10 of what they had received. In practice, however, it was a disaster. Most of the money had already been spent. The properties had been sold and resold, and trying to reclaim them created a legal and social nightmare, alienating a wide swath of the Roman elite. Furthermore, the common people saw little benefit from these measures. While Galba was pinching every penny and reclaiming old debts, he himself was seen as being under the influence of a small, corrupt clique of advisors who were enriching themselves at the public's expense. This inner circle consisted of 3 men who came to be known as Galba's 3 pedagogues. They were Titus Vinius, his trusted commander from Spain, who became consul, Cornelius Laco, who was appointed as the new Praetorian prefect, and a freedman named Icellus Marcianus, who was granted equestrian rank and wielded enormous influence. This trio effectively insulated the elderly emperor from the realities of his rule. They sold off appointments, accepted bribes, and manipulated justice, all in Galba's name. The Roman populace, which had hoped for an end to the corruption of Nero's court, felt that they had simply exchanged one set of grasping favorites for another. The public perception was that while Galba preached austerity for the state, his closest confidants were plundering it for their own gain. This hypocrisy bred deep cynicism and resentment. While his position in Rome was rapidly deteriorating, a far more dangerous storm was gathering on the northern frontier. The powerful legions stationed along the Rhine River felt deeply aggrieved. These were the armies that had put down the rebellion of Vindex, the very rebellion that had paved the way for Galba's rise. Yet, instead of being rewarded for their loyalty to the old order, they felt they were being punished. Galba had replaced their respected commander, Virginius Rufus, with a man of his own choosing. He had shown open favor to the regions in Gaul that had supported Vindex, while treating the legions with suspicion. The soldiers on the Rhine felt that their crucial role in the recent turmoil had been completely ignored. Their pride was wounded, and their loyalty to the new emperor was non-existent. On the 1st of January in 69 AD, the legions of Upper Germany took a fateful step. They refused to swear their annual oath of allegiance to Emperor Galba. The next day, they went further, proclaiming their own commander, the governor of Lower Germany, Aulus Vitellius, as the new emperor. The first civil war of the year had begun. News of the German revolt traveled quickly to Rome, throwing Galba's already precarious government into a state of emergency. It was now painfully clear that the emperor needed to shore up his authority, and the most pressing issue was the succession. Galba was old and childless. Naming a clear heir would, he hoped, create a sense of stability and demonstrate that his regime had a future. It was a decision of monumental importance, and one that would provide the final spark for his own destruction. There was one man in Rome who believed he was the obvious and only choice: Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho was a man of about 36 years of age, a flamboyant and ambitious figure from a noble Etruscan family. He had been a close companion in Nero's decadent youth, and had even been married to the infamous Poppaea Sabina before Nero took her for himself. Exiled as governor of Lusitania, Otho had become the very first provincial governor to declare his support for Galba. He had provided Galba with financial backing and had accompanied him on his march to Rome. By all accounts, he had worked tirelessly to cultivate support among the military and the political class. He was popular with the Praetorians, in part because he was seen as being reminiscent of the extravagant Nero they had admired. Otho fully, and perhaps justifiably, expected that the aged and childless Galba would adopt him as his son and successor. He saw it as the rightful reward for his early and decisive loyalty. But Galba saw in Otho everything he despised. Otho's past association with Nero, his lavish lifestyle, and his naked ambition were antithetical to Galba's own severe and traditionalist values. He believed that to name Otho as his heir would be to perpetuate the very decadence he had been chosen to end. And so, on the 10th of January in 69 AD, Galba made his fateful choice. He formally adopted not Otho, but a young nobleman named Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus. Piso was, in many ways, the perfect choice from Galba's perspective. He was a man of impeccable character, a member of an ancient noble family, and known for his modesty and integrity. He was a younger version of Galba himself, a man who represented the stoic virtues of the past. By choosing Piso, Galba believed he was making a principled decision for the good of the state, selecting the best man for the job rather than succumbing to political pressure. In doing so, however, he demonstrated a complete and fatal misunderstanding of the political situation. The adoption was carried out with a cold and aloof formality that alienated everyone. Galba announced his decision first to a small circle of advisors, then to the Senate, and finally to the Praetorian Guard assembled in their camp. His speech to the soldiers was a masterpiece of political ineptitude. He spoke to them as a stern commander addressing his troops, not as a politician trying to win their support. He reiterated his principle that soldiers should be loyal without expectation of a handout, explicitly stating that the adoption of Piso did not mean they would be receiving a special bonus. He had presented them with an heir they did not know and had no reason to like, while simultaneously confirming that they would not be getting the money they so desperately craved. And, in the process, he had created a mortal enemy. For Otho, this was the ultimate public humiliation. He had not only been passed over, but he had been scorned in favor of a man with no political base. He was also in desperate financial straits, having spent a fortune in anticipation of becoming emperor. His creditors were closing in, and he famously remarked that he could not survive unless he became emperor. His ambition, fueled by desperation and resentment, now turned to treason. He found a willing and eager audience for his plotting among the disgruntled soldiers of the Praetorian Guard. Their anger over the denied donative, their personal affection for Otho, and their general dislike of the miserly Galba made them perfect conspirators. A plot was quickly hatched. For a relatively small sum of money, Otho secured the allegiance of the men who were supposed to be the emperor's last line of defense. The end came with astonishing speed on the 15th of January, 69 AD, just 5 days after the adoption of Piso. The day began with Galba performing a religious sacrifice at the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill. During the ceremony, a soothsayer reportedly warned him of imminent danger from assassins. At that very moment, Otho, who was in attendance, excused himself, claiming he had to view a property he was considering buying. He was, in fact, slipping away to meet his co-conspirators. He was met in the city by a small group of Praetorians who hailed him as emperor and then rushed him back to the Praetorian camp. There, any remaining hesitation among the soldiers evaporated, and the entire guard proclaimed him as their new leader. Back on the Palatine Hill, confused and conflicting reports began to reach Galba. Some said Otho had been assassinated. Others claimed he had been acclaimed emperor by the Praetorians. Galba's court descended into chaos. His advisors offered contradictory counsel. Titus Vinius urged him to remain in the palace and fortify its defenses. Cornelius Laco and Icellus argued for a public display of force, believing the emperor's presence would quell the uprising. Galba, vacillating and unsure, ultimately chose the more confrontational path. He decided to be carried out into the Roman Forum in a litter to face the rebellion head-on. It was a fatal decision. As his litter, swaying and jostled by a terrified crowd, made its way into the heart of the city, the full force of the Praetorian Guard, with Otho among them, descended from their camp and charged into the Forum. The sight of the heavily armed, advancing soldiers shattered what little nerve remained among the populace and Galba's entourage. The single cohort of troops on duty at the palace, which was supposed to be guarding him, promptly deserted and joined the mutineers. The civilian crowds scattered in terror. The bearers of Galba's litter panicked, dropped it, and fled, spilling the 71-year-old emperor onto the stone pavement near a spot called the Lacus Curtius. The final moments were a scene of brutal chaos. The rebel soldiers surrounded the fallen and helpless old man. According to the historian Tacitus, Galba's last words were a matter of dispute. Some claimed he pleaded for his life, asking what he had done to deserve this. Others reported that he met his end with dignity, baring his neck to his assassins and telling them to strike if it be for the good of the Roman people. Whatever his final words may have been, they were of no consequence. The soldiers fell upon him, hacking at his limbs and throat. His chosen heir, Piso, who had fled to the sanctuary of the Temple of Vesta, was dragged out and killed on the temple steps. Titus Vinius was also cut down. The soldiers decapitated Galba and, unable to grasp his bald head, a soldier reportedly stuck his thumb in the mouth to carry it. The head was then paraded on a pike before being presented to Otho. Thus ended the reign of Servius Sulpicius Galba, after a mere 7 months in power. He was a man whose personal virtues, a sense of duty, a belief in fiscal discipline, and a commitment to traditional Roman values proved to be his political undoing. He failed to grasp the new reality of the Roman Empire, that the emperor's power rested not on the consent of the Senate or the love of the people, but on the sharpened points of the legion's swords. His attempt to govern a military empire according to the austere principles of the long-dead republic was a disastrous failure. He had alienated every crucial segment of Roman society: the military through his stinginess, the populace through his severity, and the political class through the corruption of his favorites and his clumsy handling of the succession. His death solved nothing. It merely confirmed the secret of the empire, that power was there for the taking by anyone who could command the loyalty of an army. And as the Senate meekly recognized Otho as the new emperor, the legions on the Rhine were already marching south, ready to dispute that claim with fire and steel. The bloody drama of 69 AD had only just begun. Part 2. Otho, with the decapitated head of Servius Sulpicius Galba displayed on the pole, and his chosen heir Piso lying dead on the steps of a temple, a new master of Rome was acclaimed in the Praetorian camp. Marcus Salvius Otho, the man whose ambition and bitterness had ignited this bloody coup, was now emperor. His accession to power on the 15th of January in 69 AD was not a moment of quiet triumph, but the beginning of a desperate and violent struggle for survival. He had won the throne through the swords of the Praetorian Guard, and his first challenge was to control the very forces he had unleashed. The soldiers, intoxicated by their king-making power and the promise of reward, were on a rampage. They stormed the palace and roamed the streets, demanding the execution of prominent senators and officials they suspected of being loyal to Galba. Rome was plunged into a night of terror. Otho, for all his decadent past as a companion of Nero, proved to be surprisingly adept in this initial crisis. He understood that he had to walk a razor's edge. He could not afford to alienate the soldiers who were his only power base, but he also knew that allowing them to slaughter the Senate would make his rule impossible. In a masterful display of political theater, he addressed the rampaging troops. He stood before them on the ramparts of their own camp, not as a cowering politician, but as their commander. He acknowledged their loyalty and their crucial role in his victory, but he also skillfully steered their anger away from a general massacre and towards a few specific and universally despised targets. He sanctioned the execution of Galba's most hated advisors, Titus Vinius and Cornelius Laco, offering the soldiers scapegoats for their fury. By doing so, he managed to restore a semblance of order to the city without appearing weak or ungrateful to his military backers. It was a precarious balancing act, but it worked. The immediate bloodlust was sated. The next morning, Otho faced the Roman Senate. It was a surreal and humiliating spectacle for the senators. Only days before, they had sworn oaths of loyalty to Galba and his heir, Piso. Now they were confronted by the man responsible for their murders. With the Praetorian Guard standing menacingly outside the Senate House, the senators had little choice. They fell over themselves to confer upon Otho all the traditional imperial titles and powers: Augustus, Caesar, Tribune of the Plebs, and Pontifex Maximus. They praised his clemency and wisdom, hailing him as the savior of the state. It was a performance born of pure terror, a stark illustration of how powerless the once mighty Senate had become. The real power now lay with the legions, and everyone in that room knew it. Otho, for his part, played the role of the reluctant, moderate ruler. He spoke to the Senate in conciliatory tones. In a shrewd move to win over the nervous elite, he pardoned Marius Celsus, a consul and a known, loyal supporter of Galba. This act of clemency was designed to signal that his reign would not be a bloody purge of his political opponents. He also understood that while the elite might fear him, the common people of Rome held a certain nostalgia for the emperor he most resembled, Nero. To curry favor with the populace, Otho allowed statues of Nero to be re-erected. He even reinstated some of Nero's officials and reportedly did not object when the crowds in the theater hailed him as Nero Otho. He was trying to be all things to all people, a responsible ruler to the Senate, a generous commander to the soldiers, and a populist hero to the masses. For a brief period, it seemed as if he might just succeed in consolidating his chaotic seizure of power into a stable reign. But a shadow already loomed over Italy, a storm that had been gathering long before Otho's coup. While Otho was plotting in Rome, the formidable legions on the Rhine frontier had already made their own choice for emperor. As we noted, on the 2nd of January, the armies of Lower Germany had proclaimed their commander, Aulus Vitellius, as the new ruler of the Roman world. This was not a reaction to Otho's rise, it was a direct challenge to the authority of Galba. By the time news reached the Rhine that Galba was dead and Otho was emperor, it changed nothing. The Vitellian armies were already on the march, and they had no intention of turning back. The civil war was inevitable. The force marching on Italy was arguably the most powerful military machine in the empire. These were the hardened legions that had spent decades guarding the most dangerous frontier, constantly skirmishing with Germanic tribes. They were disciplined, battle-tested, and fiercely loyal to their commanders. Vitellius had dispatched them in two main columns, a pincer movement designed to overwhelm any opposition in northern Italy. The first army, commanded by the ambitious and ruthless Aulus Caecina Alienus, was to cross the Alps through the Great St. Bernard Pass. The second, led by the equally formidable Fabius Valens, would march through Gaul and enter Italy via the Mont Genèvre Pass. Together, they represented a force of well over 70,000 elite soldiers, a tide of steel and anger flowing south towards Rome. Faced with this existential threat, Otho had to transform himself from a conspirator into a wartime commander. He was not a military man by training or temperament. His reputation was built in the decadent salons of Nero's court, not in the rugged camps of the frontier. But he acted with surprising energy and resolve. He had significant forces at his disposal. In Rome, he had the Praetorian Guard, a force of around 12,000 elite soldiers, along with other city-based units. Crucially, he had the loyalty of the powerful legions stationed along the Danube River frontier in the provinces of Pannonia, Dalmatia, and Moesia. These were experienced troops, and they immediately declared their allegiance to him and began the long march to Italy. He also controlled the Roman navy, based at Misenum, which gave him command of the seas. Otho and his generals devised a two-part strategy. First, he would use his naval superiority to land troops on the coast of southern Gaul, to harass Valens's line of march and create a diversion. Second, he would assemble his main army in northern Italy, using the Po River as a defensive line to block the Vitellian advance and buy time for his Danubian legions to arrive. He appointed several experienced commanders to lead his forces, including Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the famous general who had crushed the rebellion of Queen Boudicca in Britain, and Marius Celsus, the very man he had pardoned. This demonstrated a willingness to utilize talent regardless of past loyalties. However, Otho's court was rife with suspicion and intrigue. He did not fully trust these old guard generals, who he feared might still harbor loyalties to Galba. He placed his greater confidence in more questionable figures, like his own brother Titianus and the Praetorian prefect Licinius Proculus, men whose loyalty was certain but whose military skill was not. This division and mistrust within his own high command would prove to be a fatal weakness. In early March of 69 AD, Otho himself left Rome to join his army in the north, leaving the administration of the city in the hands of his brother. The initial phases of the campaign went surprisingly well for Otho's forces. The Vitellian commander Caecina, having crossed the Alps, made a rash attempt to storm the well-defended town of Placentia. The attack was repulsed with heavy losses, a humiliating first defeat for the supposedly invincible Rhine army. This victory, though small, was a huge morale boost for the Othonian troops. In another engagement, known as the Battle of the Gladiators, a force of Otho's specially trained gladiators fought with surprising effectiveness, routing a unit of Vitellian auxiliaries. These early successes seemed to suggest that the war was far from a foregone conclusion. Otho's forces were capable, and his commanders were competent. The strategic situation, however, took a turn for the worse when the Second Vitellian army, under Fabius Valens, successfully linked up with Caecina's forces near the city of Cremona. Their combined army now presented a single, massive threat. Otho's army, though reinforced by the first of the Danubian legions, was still likely outnumbered. At this critical juncture, a council of war was held in the Othonian camp. It was here that the most fateful decision of the campaign was made. The experienced generals, led by Suetonius Paulinus, argued for caution and delay. Their strategy was sound and logical. The Vitellian army was a formidable force in a pitched battle, but it was operating far from its supply bases. The soldiers of the Rhine were not accustomed to the Italian climate, and the impending summer heat would take its toll. Sickness and desertion were already becoming problems in their camp. Meanwhile, the bulk of Otho's powerful Danubian legions were still days or weeks away from arriving. Time, Paulinus argued, was Otho's greatest ally. He advocated for a strategy of containment and harassment, avoiding a decisive battle until all of their forces were assembled. With their full strength gathered, victory would be almost certain. This prudent, professional military advice was opposed by Otho's more impatient and politically minded advisors, including his brother Titianus and the Praetorian prefect Proculus. They argued that delay was a sign of weakness and cowardice. They were suspicious of Paulinus, suggesting his caution was a form of disguised treachery. They pushed for a swift, decisive battle to crush the enemy and secure Otho's rule once and for all. Otho, the politician, was more swayed by these arguments. A long, drawn-out war would create uncertainty in Rome and could encourage others to challenge his authority. He craved the legitimacy that only a glorious and immediate military victory could provide. He was tired of waiting. Against the strenuous objections of his best commanders, Otho made his decision. He would seek a decisive battle. Compounding this strategic error, he made another, even more damaging tactical one. He was persuaded by his inner circle to withdraw from the front lines and direct the final stages of the campaign from a safe distance, at a town called Brixellum. The official reason was to remove the emperor from the personal danger of the battlefield. The actual effect was catastrophic for the morale of his army. The The soldiers, who were personally devoted to Otho, felt abandoned by their leader at the most critical moment. His departure also created a vacuum of command. His brother Titianus was given nominal command, but the generals were left to bicker and dispute the plan of attack, a plan they fundamentally disagreed with. On the 14th of April in 69 AD, the Othonian army marched out to meet its fate. The plan was flawed from the start. The soldiers were ordered to march a considerable distance along the Via Postumia towards the Vitellian camp near Cremona. By the time they encountered the enemy, they were already tired from the march. The Vitellian forces, by contrast, were fresh, well-rested, and expertly deployed. The engagement that followed, known as the First Battle of Bedriacum, was a brutal and confused affair. It began with a possible misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate act of treachery, which led to the two armies clashing with savage intensity. It was the horrific spectacle of Roman legionary fighting. Roman legionary, eagle standard against eagle standard. The fighting was desperate and bloody, but the superior positioning and freshness of the Vitellian troops soon began to tell. The Othonian lines buckled and then broke. The battle turned into a rout, with thousands of Otho's soldiers cut down as they fled back towards their camp. By nightfall, the field belonged to Vitellius's generals. The defeat was total and devastating. News of the catastrophic outcome reached Otho at Brixellum. His world had collapsed. Yet, in this moment of ultimate defeat, he displayed a character that astonished his contemporaries. His remaining commanders and soldiers rallied around him. They pleaded with him to continue the fight. They reminded him that his cause was not lost. The survivors of the battle could be regrouped. And, most importantly, the fresh and formidable Danubian legions were now very close, ready to avenge the defeat. Militarily, they had a strong case. The war could still be won, but Otho had had enough of civil war. In a final, lucid address to his heartbroken soldiers, he declared his intention to die. He told them that he would not allow more of Rome's finest soldiers to be sacrificed for his personal ambition. "Let me be the one sacrificed for you all," he reportedly said. He argued that it was more noble to die to bring peace to the state than to continue a war that would only lead to more destruction. He calmly put his affairs in order, writing letters of farewell to his sister and encouraging his nephew to live a quiet life. To protect his supporters from any future reprisals, he burned all of his personal correspondence. Then he retired to his tent for the night. As dawn broke on the 16th of April, Marcus Salvius Otho, after a reign of just 95 days, took his own life by falling upon his sword. He was 36 years old. His death was a strange and poignant end to a life of ambition and a reign born of violence. He had seized power like a ruthless gangster, but he relinquished it with a dignity that many Romans saw as the act of a noble patriot. His suicide was a final, shocking gamble to halt the cycle of civil war he had helped to create. But the peace he died for would be fleeting. His death did not end the conflict. It merely created another power vacuum. The Senate in Rome quickly swore allegiance to the victor, Vitellius. The path to the capital was now open for the gluttonous general and his victorious Rhine legions. The second emperor of the year was dead, and the third was about to take the stage. Part 3. Vitellius. With Otho's noble suicide, a brief and fragile peace settled over the blood-soaked fields of northern Italy. His soldiers, heartbroken and leaderless, surrendered to the victorious Vitellian commanders. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the civil war might be over. The Roman world now had a single, undisputed master, Aulus Vitellius. But the man himself was nowhere near the battlefield. He was still lumbering his way south from his base in Gaul, blissfully unaware of the decisive victory that had just been won in his name. The news of the triumph at Bedriacum and Otho's subsequent death reached him as he was traveling. Now, the path to Rome lay open, and the true character of the new emperor and his conquering army would be revealed to the horrified Italian peninsula. The victorious army that now controlled Italy was not a disciplined force of occupation. It was a plague of locusts. Composed primarily of the legions from the German frontier, these soldiers were hardened fighters, but they were also accustomed to the rough and tumble life of the provinces. They viewed Italy not as their homeland to be protected, but as a rich prize to be plundered. Led by the two principal commanders, Aulus Caecina Alienus and Fabius Valens, the army began a slow, destructive march southward. Caecina was a man of boundless ambition and ostentatious vanity, while Valens was notorious for his avarice and greed. Neither man had the will or the inclination to impose strict discipline on the troops. Instead, they allowed their soldiers to run riot. The legionaries and their auxiliary troops looted villas, ransacked towns, and terrorized the countryside. They were an occupying force in their own country, and their march left a trail of devastation and resentment. Finally, the emperor himself, Aulus Vitellius, joined his victorious legions. If the Roman elite had hoped for a leader who would restore order and discipline, they were to be sorely disappointed. Vitellius was a man in his mid-50s from a family that had risen to prominence under the Julio-Claudian emperors. He had spent his youth on the Isle of Capri with the paranoid and cruel emperor Tiberius, where he earned a reputation as a sycophant. He was known not for his military prowess or his administrative skill, but for two things: his affable, easygoing nature and his monumental gluttony. He was a man utterly devoid of personal ambition, a lazy and indulgent figure who had been pushed onto the throne by his more aggressive and capable commanders. He was, in essence, a figurehead, a ruler in name only, and he seemed perfectly content with this arrangement as long as his appetites were satisfied. The journey of Vitellius and his army from the north of Italy to Rome was not a stately imperial procession. It was a monstrous, chaotic carnival of victory. The army, now swollen with camp followers, entertainers, and hangers-on, numbered well over 60,000 soldiers, moving not as a military unit, but as a vast, unruly mob. They continued their plunder as they went, draining the resources of every town they passed through. Senators and knights from Rome were compelled to travel north to greet their new emperor, and many were forced to join his traveling court, bankrupting themselves to provide lavish entertainments for Vitellius and his commanders. One of the most revealing and grotesque episodes of this journey occurred when Vitellius reached the battlefield of Bedriacum, where the decisive battle had been fought some 40 days earlier. The field was still a horrifying scene of carnage, littered with the decomposing, unburied corpses of thousands of Roman soldiers. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. While many in his entourage were sickened by the sight, Vitellius showed no remorse or disgust. He toured the field with a morbid curiosity, as if inspecting a work of art. It was here that he is said to have uttered one of the most infamous remarks in Roman history. When one of his companions complained about the smell, Vitellius callously replied, "The corpse of an enemy smells sweet, but that of a fellow citizen sweeter still." This statement, whether entirely true or embellished by hostile historians, perfectly captured the horrifying detachment of the new regime. He saw the field, not as a national tragedy, the site where Romans had slaughtered Romans, but as the proof of his personal victory. In July of 69 AD, Vitellius finally made his formal entry into Rome. He did so not as a civilian magistrate, but as a conquering general. He rode at the head of his troops, who marched in full battle order, their legionary eagles and standards held high. This was a shocking and ominous sight for the people of Rome. Traditionally, a general was forbidden from bringing his army inside the sacred boundary of the city, the pomerium. To do so was an act of tyranny, a clear statement that military force had triumphed over law and tradition. Vitellius's entry was precisely that, a declaration that the Rhine legions were now the masters of the empire and their commander was the master of Rome. Once installed in the palace, Vitellius's reign, if it can be called that, began in earnest. It was a reign characterized by a complete abdication of responsibility in favor of unrestrained indulgence. He showed no interest in the day-to-day business of governing the vast empire. He did not attend the Senate, did not concern himself with the law courts, and paid no attention to the state's finances. All real power was delegated to his two chief commanders, Caecina and Valens, who vied with each other for influence and busied themselves with enriching themselves and their followers. The administration of the empire fell into the hands of a freedman, Asiaticus, who became as powerful and corrupt as any of the hated freedmen who had dominated the court of the Emperor Claudius. Vitellius's primary, and seemingly only, concern was food. His name has become synonymous with gluttony for a reason. His reign was one long, continuous banquet. He would reportedly attend 3 or 4 massive feasts a day, inviting himself to the houses of different Roman nobles for each meal, a ruinously expensive honor for his hosts. These were not simple dinners, they were epic displays of conspicuous consumption. The most exotic and expensive delicacies were procured from all corners of the empire. Pike livers, pheasant brains, flamingo tongues, and the roe of lamprey eels were staples of his table. One legendary dish, which he named the Shield of Minerva, the Protectress, was said to contain a mixture of all these ingredients, served on a platter of enormous size that had to be specially manufactured. To enable himself to consume such vast quantities of food, Vitellius would regularly induce vomiting during meals, a common, if distasteful, practice among the Roman elite, but one which he took to an extreme. While the emperor was gorging himself, the Roman state was hemorrhaging money. The treasury, which Galba had tried so hard to replenish, was quickly emptied to pay for these banquets and to fund the lavish bonuses he bestowed upon his soldiers. His military policy, driven by the need to reward his own troops, proved to be a catastrophic mistake. One of his first acts was to deal with the existing military units in Rome. He disbanded the 17 existing cohorts of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who had been loyal to Otho. He also dismissed the urban cohorts and the city watch. In their place, he created a new, much larger Praetorian Guard, 16 cohorts strong, drawn exclusively from the ranks of his own loyal German legions. This decision had two disastrous consequences. Firstly, it created a massive body of over 10,000 trained, unemployed, and deeply resentful soldiers living in and around Rome. These former Praetorians were now a dangerous, destabilizing force, a ready-made army waiting for a new leader to rise. Secondly, his new guards, accustomed to the rough life of the frontier, were completely undisciplined. They did not adapt to life in the capital. They brawled in the streets, terrorized civilians, and were contemptuous of any authority other than their own. Under their watch, Rome descended into a state of near anarchy. While Vitellius and his followers were feasting and celebrating in a city teetering on the brink of chaos, a far more serious threat was quietly coalescing in the eastern provinces of the empire. The vast legions stationed in Syria, Judea, and Egypt had watched the events in Italy with growing alarm and disgust. These were professional, battle-hardened armies, and they had little respect for the undisciplined and arrogant soldiers of the Rhine. News of Vitellius's gluttony and incompetence and the breakdown of order in Rome solidified their conviction that the new emperor was unfit to rule. They felt that their own commanders, the men who were capably managing the empire's most critical eastern frontiers, were far more deserving of the throne. The key players in this emerging conspiracy were three of the most powerful men in the Roman world. The first was Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the governor of Syria. Mucianus was a cunning, eloquent, and highly experienced statesman and general. He commanded a powerful army of 4 legions. He was also a man of immense personal ambition, but he was shrewd enough to recognize that he himself, being a childless aristocrat of somewhat dubious reputation, was not the ideal candidate for emperor. He was a kingmaker, not a king. The second figure was Tiberius Julius Alexander, the prefect of Egypt. As governor of Egypt, he controlled 2 legions, but more importantly, he controlled Rome's grain supply. The ability to shut off the flow of grain to the capital was a strategic weapon of immense power. The third and most crucial figure was the man they both decided to back, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian. Vespasian was the commander of the 3 legions currently engaged in suppressing the great Jewish revolt in the province of Judea. He was everything Vitellius was not. He was 60 years old, from a humble equestrian family, not the old nobility. He was a professional soldier who had risen through the ranks on sheer merit. He had distinguished himself in the invasion of Britain under the Emperor Claudius and had a reputation for being down-to-earth, pragmatic, and incorruptible. He was respected, even loved, by his soldiers, whom he led from the front. He was the very model of an old-fashioned Roman general, disciplined, effective, and unpretentious. Throughout the spring of 69 AD, as Otho and Vitellius fought for control of Italy, these eastern commanders had waited and watched. Now, with Vitellius on the throne and proving himself a disaster, the time for waiting was over. Mucianus and Vespasian, who had previously been rivals, met in secret and forged a powerful alliance. Mucianus, the master politician, persuaded the more hesitant Vespasian that it was their duty to save the state from the ruinous rule of Vitellius. He pledged the support of his Syrian legions and argued that Vespasian, as a family man with 2 grown sons, was the perfect candidate to found a new, stable dynasty. The plan they formulated was brilliant in its strategic simplicity. Vespasian would remain in the east to consolidate their power base. Mucianus would lead a significant portion of their combined armies overland, through Asia Minor and into the Balkans, to challenge Vitellius in Europe. But the first decisive move would be made by Tiberius Alexander in Egypt. On the 1st of July in 69 AD, on the instruction of his allies, Alexander commanded his legions to swear an oath of allegiance to Vespasian as the new emperor. This date would be officially recognized as the beginning of Vespasian's reign. 2 days later, on the 3rd of July, Vespasian's own legions in Judea followed suit, enthusiastically proclaiming their commander emperor. Soon after, the legions in Syria did the same. The Flavian party, as it would come to be known from Vespasian's family name, had been born. With a single, coordinated move, they had seized control of the entire eastern half of the empire and, most critically, its wealth and grain supply. The news of this formidable rebellion began to trickle back to Rome. At first, Vitellius and his court did not seem to grasp the mortal danger they were in. They were lost in their world of banquets and celebrations, seemingly oblivious to the professional and determined military machine that was now mobilizing against them. They had enjoyed a few short months of drunken, gluttonous victory, but that time was over. While Vitellius had been gorging himself in Rome, a new, far more dangerous civil war was about to erupt. The third emperor of the year was about to face his final and most formidable challenger. Part 4. Vespasian. The acclamation of Vespasian as emperor on the 1st of July in 69 AD by the legions in Egypt marked the beginning of the end for Aulus Vitellius. While the emperor in Rome was distracted by his endless feasts, a new and far more organized challenge to his authority was rapidly taking shape. The leaders of this new Flavian party, Vespasian, Mucianus, and Tiberius Alexander, were not rash adventurers like Otho. They were seasoned, methodical, and patient men. They had a clear strategy, a unified command structure, and the loyalty of some of the most battle-hardened legions in the entire Roman Empire. Their rebellion was not a desperate gamble, it was a calculated and confident bid to save the state and establish a new, stable dynasty. The Flavian grand strategy was a testament to their military and political acumen. Vespasian, the new emperor claimant, would remain in the east for the time being. This served two purposes. First, it allowed him to secure their most critical strategic asset, Egypt. By controlling Egypt's vast grain supply, they held a stranglehold over the city of Rome, which was utterly dependent on Egyptian imports to feed its massive population. Vespasian traveled to Alexandria, from where he could manage the blockade and organize the resources of the wealthy eastern provinces. Second, his presence in the east provided a secure rear base. If the initial invasion of Europe were to fail, he and his sons would be safe, ready to regroup and continue the fight. The task of leading the main invasion force fell to the governor of Syria, Gaius Licinius Mucianus. A skilled politician and a competent general, Mucianus was to lead a powerful army of over 20,000 legionaries on a long overland march through Asia Minor and the Balkans to confront Vitellius in Italy. This would be the main thrust of their attack. However, events would soon move much faster than even they had anticipated. The news of Vespasian's claim to power spread like wildfire through the military camps of the empire. It resonated most strongly with the legions stationed along the Danube River frontier, the armies of Moesia, Pannonia, and Dalmatia. These were the very legions that had declared for Otho and had been marching to his aid when they received news of his defeat and suicide at the first battle of Bedriacum. They had been forced to turn back in humiliation, their loyalty to the new emperor Vitellius grudging at best. They despised the arrogance of the victorious Rhine legions and felt a burning desire to avenge their fallen comrades and their own wounded pride. The commander of the 7th Galbian Legion in Pannonia, a fiery and aggressive general named Marcus Antonius Primus, saw his opportunity. Acting on his own initiative, without waiting for direct orders from Vespasian or Mucianus, Primus rallied the Danubian legions to the Flavian cause. He argued passionately that they should not wait for Mucianus's slower-moving army, but should strike immediately into Italy while Vitellius was unprepared. His impassioned speeches ignited the soldiers' desire for revenge, and they enthusiastically joined the rebellion. In the early autumn of 69 AD, Antonius Primus led his Danubian army across the Julian Alps and descended into northern Italy. His was a lightning campaign, characterized by speed and aggression. He completely outmaneuvered the Vitellian forces, capturing key cities like Aquileia and Padua. The Vitellian commanders, Caecina and Valens, were caught completely off guard. Their response was slow and disorganized. Vitellius himself, finally roused from his gluttonous stupor in Rome, seemed incapable of decisive action. He dispatched Caecina with a large force to confront the invasion, while Valens, who had fallen ill, was to follow with reinforcements. But the Vitellian camp was plagued by low morale and crumbling loyalty. Caecina, the vain and ambitious commander who had helped put Vitellius on the throne, now decided to betray him. He began secret negotiations with the Flavians, intending to switch sides and bring his entire army with him. He tried to persuade his soldiers to abandon Vitellius and swear a new oath of allegiance to Vespasian, but he had completely misjudged the mood of his men. The soldiers of the Rhine legions, for all their lack of discipline, were fiercely loyal to the emperor they had created. They were outraged by Caecina's treachery. They threw him in chains and reaffirmed their loyalty to Vitellius, but the incident left their army leaderless and in a state of confusion at the most critical possible moment. Antonius Primus, sensing the disarray in the enemy camp, decided to press his advantage. He marched his army towards the city of Cremona, the same area where the first battle of the year had been fought. The Vitellian forces, now under the command of their remaining, less experienced generals, marched out to meet him. On the 24th of October, 69 AD, the two armies clashed just outside the city walls. The engagement that followed, known as the Second Battle of Bedriacum, was one of the most brutal and horrific battles in the entire history of Roman civil wars. The fighting began late in the evening and continued throughout the entire night, a rare and terrifying occurrence in ancient warfare. The darkness was illuminated only by the light of the moon and the flickering of torches. The soldiers fought with a savage intensity, driven by a mutual hatred. For the Danubian legions, this was their chance for revenge. For the German legions, it was a desperate struggle for survival. The battle swayed back and forth for hours in the confused darkness, with neither side able to gain a clear advantage. The turning point came with the rising of the sun. As dawn broke, the Flavian legions, who were facing east, greeted the rising sun with a loud cheer, a custom among the legions stationed in Syria. The demoralized Vitellian troops, exhausted from a night of fighting, mistakenly believed this was a cheer for reinforcements arriving from Mucianus's army. Their spirit broke. They fell back in disarray, and the retreat quickly turned into a rout. The Flavian victory was absolute, but what followed was a stain on their triumph. The victorious Danubian soldiers pursued the fleeing enemy right up to the walls of Cremona. The city, which had supported the Vitellian cause, was a wealthy and prosperous trading center. The Vitellian soldiers took refuge within its walls, but the defenses were quickly overwhelmed. What followed was not a military occupation, but a 4-day orgy of destruction. Antonius Primus, unable or unwilling to control his enraged troops, gave them permission to sack the city. For 4 days and 4 nights, the soldiers raped, murdered, and looted with impunity. They set fire to the magnificent buildings, and the great city of Cremona was burned to the ground. The sack of Cremona sent a shockwave of horror throughout Italy. It was a brutal demonstration of the destructive power of civil war, a horrifying testament to the depths to which Roman soldiers could sink when turned against their own people. With the Vitellian army in northern Italy shattered, the road to Rome was now open. Antonius Primus, flush with victory, was determined to end the war quickly. He began his march down the Italian peninsula, his army's advance marked by fear and destruction. In Rome, the news of the disaster at Cremona caused widespread panic. Vitellius was now a desperate man. He made clumsy, half-hearted attempts to fortify the city and rally support, but his authority had evaporated. Fabius Valens, his one remaining capable general, was captured and executed while trying to raise support in Gaul. Left with no other options, Vitellius began to contemplate abdication. At this point, a new figure entered the scene in Rome. Vespasian's older brother, Titus Flavius Sabinus, who held the prestigious post of city prefect. Sabinus, a respected and moderate man, negotiated a peaceful transfer of power with Vitellius. On the 18th of December, in a pathetic ceremony, Vitellius emerged from the palace in mourning clothes, ready to hand over the insignia of imperial power, his sword to the consul. He told the assembled crowds that he was stepping down for the sake of peace and the good of the state. But his own soldiers, particularly the German praetorians, refused to allow it. They could not accept the surrender of the emperor they had fought for. They forced Vitellius back into the palace, their loyalty now a death sentence for him. The situation in the city rapidly spiraled out of control. The Flavian supporters in Rome, emboldened by the prospect of surrender, clashed with the remaining Vitellian loyalists. Sabinus, Vespasian's brother, along with other prominent Flavians, was forced to take refuge on the Capitoline Hill, the religious and symbolic heart of the city. The Vitellian soldiers laid siege to the hill. In the ensuing struggle, a fire broke out. and the ancient and sacred Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the most important religious building in the entire Roman world, was burned to the ground. This act of sacrilege, the destruction of the temple that had stood for centuries as a symbol of Rome's power and divine favor, was the ultimate horror in a year of horrors. It was seen as a terrible omen, a sign that the gods themselves had abandoned the city. Sabinus was captured during the fighting and, despite Vitellius's apparent attempts to save him, was brutally murdered, his body thrown down the Gemonian stairs, the infamous staircase reserved for the public display of executed criminals. The news of the fighting in Rome and the murder of his brother drove Antonius Primus into a fury. He accelerated his march, and on the 20th of December, his army reached the gates of Rome. The city's defenses were token at best, and the Flavian legions poured into the capital from multiple directions. What followed was the final, tragic act of the Civil War, a vicious and bloody street battle for control of Rome itself. The fighting raged in the Forum, on the city's famous hills, and even in the gardens and suburbs. The civilian population was caught in the crossfire, and the city became a war zone. The Praetorian camp was stormed, and its last defenders were slaughtered. In the midst of this chaos, Vitellius met his end. He had tried to escape the city in disguise, but, losing his nerve, he returned to the now empty palace. He was discovered hiding in the doorkeeper's quarters by a Flavian soldier. What followed was a final, prolonged humiliation. He was dragged, half-naked and covered in filth, through the streets of the city he had so briefly ruled. The Roman mob, which had once cheered him, now jeered and pelted him with refuse. He was tortured and taunted as he was paraded through the Forum, the very heart of Roman public life. Finally, he was dragged to the Gemonian stairs, the same place where Vespasian's brother had been killed. There, he was slowly and brutally tortured to death. His last words, according to the historian Cassius Dio, were defiant. When a soldier mocked him, he retorted, "And yet, I was your emperor." His body was thrown into the Tiber River. The death of Vitellius on the 20th of December in 69 AD marked the end of the civil war. The Senate immediately met and formally conferred all imperial powers upon the absent Vespasian. The chaos was over. The year of the 4 emperors had come to a close. From the elderly Galba, who had ruled for 7 months, to the ambitious Otho, who had lasted just 3, to the gluttonous Vitellius, whose reign was a brief 8 months of indulgence, the empire had been torn apart by the personal ambitions of generals and the violent loyalties of their legions. The victor, Vespasian, was a different kind of leader. He was not a product of the old Roman aristocracy, but a practical, hard-working soldier from a new Italian elite. He represented stability, discipline, and fiscal responsibility. His victory was not just a personal triumph, it was the dawn of a new era. It marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty, which would rule Rome for the next 27 years and restore peace and prosperity to the battered empire. Vespasian would go on to be remembered as one of Rome's most successful and effective emperors, a ruler who healed the wounds of civil war, rebuilt the state's finances, and initiated massive building projects, including the most famous Roman landmark of all, the Flavian Amphitheatre, which we know today as the Colosseum. The brutal and bloody year of 69 AD had been a terrifying lesson in the fragility of power, but from its ashes, a new and resilient Rome would rise. Conclusion: the dawn of the Flavian dynasty. And so, with the brutal death of Vitellius in the war-torn streets of Rome, the year 69 Anno Domini, the year of the 4 emperors, came to its bloody conclusion. What began with the fall of a dynasty ended with the birth of a new one. This single, chaotic year fundamentally altered the Roman Empire, stripping away its illusions and exposing the raw and often violent nature of its power structures. The lessons learned in the crucible of this year-long civil war would echo for centuries to come. The most profound lesson was what the historian Tacitus called the secret of the empire, that an emperor could be made outside of Rome. For a century, the succession had been a drama played out within the capital, decided by the imperial family, the Senate, and the Praetorian Guard. But the events of 69 AD proved that the true kingmakers were not the politicians in their togas, but the hardened legions on the distant frontiers. The armies of Spain had made Galba emperor. The Praetorians in Rome had elevated Otho. The legions of the Rhine had chosen Vitellius. And finally, the powerful armies of the East had secured the throne for Vespasian. The ultimate authority did not rest in the will of the Senate or the people, but in the loyalty of the soldiers and their willingness to fight and die for their chosen commander. Military might had been revealed as the final and most persuasive argument in Roman politics. The year also demonstrated the devastating consequences of personal ambition and flawed leadership. Galba, the stern disciplinarian, failed because he could not adapt his old republican principles to the new reality of a military empire. His austerity and refusal to reward the soldiers who backed him was a fatal miscalculation. Otho, the ambitious courtier, showed surprising resolve but could not escape the consequences of the very civil war he had helped to start, ultimately choosing suicide to prevent further bloodshed. And Vitellius, the indulgent glutton, proved to be a ruler in name only, a man whose apathy and incompetence allowed the empire to drift into chaos while he feasted. Each man, in his own way, was a product of the crisis, but none, until the very end, was the solution. The solution arrived in the form of the fourth and final emperor of that year, Vespasian. His victory marked a clear and decisive break with the past. He was not a member of the ancient Julio-Claudian aristocracy. He was a practical, pragmatic, and professional soldier from a humble Italian family who had earned his position through decades of competent service. He was the antithesis of the decadent Nero, the rigid Galba, the rash Otho, and the lazy Vitellius. Vespasian was a leader who understood both the army and the administration of the state. He was exactly the kind of steady, no-nonsense ruler the exhausted empire needed. His victory ushered in the Flavian dynasty, a new period of stability that would last for 27 years. With his sons, Titus and Domitian, he would restore the state's shattered finances, famously saying that money does not stink. He re-established discipline in the legions and secured the frontiers. He healed the wounds of the civil war and began the physical and moral reconstruction of Rome. Out of the ashes of the Capitoline Hill, he rebuilt the great Temple of Jupiter. And, as a lasting monument to his new dynasty and a gift to the Roman people, he began construction on one of the most iconic buildings in human history. The Flavian Amphitheatre, known to us today as the Colosseum, built on the former site of Nero's extravagant Golden House. In closing, the Year of the Four Emperors stands as a brutal but pivotal chapter in Roman history. It was a terrifying demonstration of how quickly the veneer of civilization could be stripped away, plunging the world's greatest empire into a savage internal conflict. It was a year that saw Roman legionaries turn their swords on each other with a ferocity usually reserved for foreign enemies. But from that chaos, a new order was born. The terrible crucible of 69 AD burned away the last vestiges of the First Imperial Dynasty and forged a new one, founded not on inherited glory, but on proven military and administrative merit. The Year of Anarchy gave way to an era of restoration, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the desire for peace and stability can ultimately prevail. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.